So how do you treat vocals for mastering and mixing? Well, I would probably start. That's probably the best thing. I usually, if I've got I listen when I get how to get the level right for me is I'll listen quietly on say NS10s from the side, sort of off center, so I can hear like where it is, and I can usually tell straight away if something's like.
Especially on an NS10, if something's not right.
Yeah, I can usually tell, but I can hear anyway if a vocal level's too loud or too quiet. I can pop the vocal out sometimes with a little bit of MSEQ. Try not to do that too much. Where I can lift it in the mids. If you do like I don't know, about 1.7 K, and on a shelf, it will lift it off just in the mid, on the mid of the EQ, and so that sometimes will lift it up. Now, sometimes if something's really piercingly bright, and it's like, I might DS a bit in that area and get it so that it's not hard. But the problem is with that is you've got to really watch, because you've got snares and things like that happening in the same place, and you still want them to be, like, the snare's really important when you're mastering and obviously mixing, but the snare's really, like, as good as the bass, isn't it? It's just really keeping the track kicking along. So as soon as you take any snap out of that, you know, it can really ruin a mix.
And the rhythm of the hat, everything, things that are in that area.
So you've got to really watch that. So a lot of the time, I'm more likely, if the vocal's too high, usually it's never really a problem, right? It's usually vocals higher are better than vocals lower.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So if you're giving a mix to a mastering engineer, give it a dB up or a dB and a half up on what you think it should be, or give them a version a dB up.
Yeah, a couple of versions.
Because when you're in mastering, because you're limiting and compressing, sometimes with the vocal right out there, it's just going to get pushed back into the track a little bit and then sit in the right place. So if you're worried, I would always listen quietly, like I say, off speaker, and pop it so that it's just sitting on top of the mix, because when it's mastered, it's probably going to come down. Every time I've mastered like big records for like with big producers, and it's for pop stuff, the vocal level is way out. Yeah. And you think, this sounds odd. Yeah. Like, I remember years ago, Robbie Williams stuff, that was the one that stands out in my mind. And it was mental. And I was thinking, this is crazy. But then as soon as it's mastered, it comes in,
everything
and it
else
sounds
comes up
really
around
good. That's
it?
radio, though, we're talking there, because it's on smaller speakers like these, and it's got to come through, and it really makes the track pop along for that kind of vocally, you know, that real sort of pop stuff. So that's kind of how I'm dealing with it. I'll ask for a vox up if I think it's too low. Yeah. Sometimes if it is too high, if it's really high, and you're better off just saying, look, drop it. Do us a favour, drop it a bit. Or give us the stems, and I can do the backing track, and I can reposition the vocal.
And maybe ride that balance a little bit as
and I can EQ that vocal. I did that recently, where I could re-EQ the vocal on one stem, and then lay that over the top of the master track, because there's nothing worse with vocals if the vocal is bright and the backing track is dull. Because what happens is I've got to then brighten up the whole track, but then the vocal's coming out and it's ripping your head off. Yeah. So if you're really worried about it, send the track to the mastering engineer first of all, or send them a vox up, send them instrumental backing track with the vocal separately, because then they've got some adjustment to make. But a lot of the times, trust your instincts and trust your own sound, because don't give people too many options, because they'll tend to maybe go in a direction you might not want. Especially if it's an unattended session. If it's attended, then it's no problem. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of it for me. You know, if it's dull backing track, shocker. Yeah. You know, and also bright backing track with a dull vocal.
You're always having to compensate.
And then it's just, oh dear, you know, it doesn't feel right. Especially if somebody's done the vocal over the back of another track and it sounds really disjointed then. But with mixing, how do you treat
mixing
vocals
wise,
mainly?
well, because you're dealing with a stereo file, you've already got a barrier, like an obstacle that you've got to kind of overcome. Whereas with mixing, I've just got the vocal, so I can do kind of what I like. I'm sort of liking like the 3K area just to get that vocal pushed through, but it does depend. I mean, if I'm doing sort of poppier stuff,
it must depend how well it's recorded in the first place.
Yeah, I mean the recording has
surely
to be,
you don't like everything we always talk about is the less processing you have to do, the better everything is.
Yeah, I mean if it's recorded badly, if you've got a lot of headphone spill, and again if it's like a rubbish microphone or the environment that it was recorded in, and you've got a lot of room on the recording, there's not much you can do about it, and you kind of have to work with what you've got. But I've still got the ability to be working on just the vocal. I'm not worried about if I'm working a frequency or trying to get rid of something that's not that great, like sibilance. I'm just worried about the vocal sibilance. I'm not worried about, right, it's vocal sibilance, but I've got hat there and I've got top of snare there and I've got like the high synth parts. All I'm working on is the vocal.
Are you cutting low frequencies off vocals?
A lot, especially
because I guess that's like an area where it can all start getting a little bit muddy in the mix.
I mean, a lot of the stuff I'm doing at the minute, like the bassier stuff, like the drum and bass type stuff, I'm literally cutting my vocals to places where the people that are sat in on the session are like, whoa, what are you doing?
Yeah.
But then in solo, it's just the thinnest vocal. But then once everything else is behind it, that vocal sits perfectly. And I'm literally cutting like 200, 300 hertz.
Yeah.
Completely, it's gone.
Right.
And then on its own, it sounds really thin. But then when everything else is in the track,
it's sitting okay.
It sits perfectly.
There's other things
nice.
making,
making
and then space for the other stuff.
And I can afford to turn it up. That, like you say, that extra 1.5 dB in the mix stage, give it a bit of a 3K push or something, just so it sticks out a bit.
Yeah.
But I'm not lifting. Once I've lifted that 1.5 dB, I'm not lifting that in the 300 or the 200 area, which you get a lot of chest. Yeah. And then in turn would just make everything else sound muddy.
Something else I do actually, when you're talking about that, is I sometimes add around 600.
Yeah, the body.
Because that is just really gives it a nice bit of width to a vocal. If a vocal's a little bit screechy and a little bit edgy, just adding that 600, just a small amount. Because also that's hitting the bottom for mastering. That's hitting the bottom of the snare as well. So it just makes everything sound a little bit. And it can get boxy if you do a lot of it. It gets really boxy sounding and horrible.
But I mean that 600 bump is lovely once you've cut that 200, 250 out completely.
Right. Yeah.
If you keep that in and you add a little bit more here, it's just like it sounds like you're on the microphone. Whereas once you've cut all of that low out, again in solo it's going to sound thin and it's not going to sound great. But I rarely
But
mix
you're not listening
vocals
in solo.
It's pointless.
Yeah.
Like if I'm recording the vocal and I'm doing a quick mix while the person's sat in the room, and for ego purposes you want them to feel like it sounds pretty good at rough stage.
Yeah.
Maybe do a bit in solo. But once I'm mixing a track, I rarely do anything in solo, especially vocal, because it has to sound good with the track. It needs to stick out, but also sit in. It needs to feel nice.
So if you're given a vocal that's really edgy and thin, so how are you getting around that? Because if it sounds like it's made on a radio, on a radio, where they've banded out loads of stuff.
A lot of the time I would accentuate the fact of, accentuate the fault. So, something that at first listen, you'd think, well, that sounds wrong.
Okay, well, I hope there's a few ideas in there for you, and it explains how I do it for mastering, how Shay does it for mixing. And please leave us some comments. Please subscribe in the corner over there. Thanks for watching. Until next time. Bye.